In the early 1800s, America was changing fast. Cotton was called white gold, and farmers wanted more and more land to grow it. But much of this land was already home to Native American tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. To white settlers, the Native Americans stood in the way of progress. But to the tribes, this land was sacred. It was their home, their history, their ancestors' graves. When Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, he was determined to clear this land for settlers. Jackson believed that Native Americans could never live peacefully side by side with white Americans. His solution was simple but cruel: move them west, far away from their homelands. In 1830, Jackson pushed Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. This law gave the president power to negotiate treaties with native tribes. On paper, it sounded voluntary. Tribes would exchange their land in the east for new land in the west, in present-day Oklahoma. But in reality, the act was forced. The government pressured tribal leaders into unfair treaties, often signed by just a few representatives, not the whole tribe. Once signed, the treaties became excuses for removal. The act promised money, land, and protection to the tribes. But behind these promises was one truth: the U.S. wanted native lands for settlers, farming, and gold. Many Americans opposed the act. Missionaries, church leaders, and even some politicians called it unjust. But Jackson ignored them. He said removal would save Native Americans. In truth, it destroyed them. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 became the legal weapon that started one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 did not affect just one tribe. It changed the lives of 5 powerful nations: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Together, they were known as the 5 civilized tribes, because many had adopted American ways: farming, schools, even written laws. But even this could not save them. The Choctaw were the first to be removed. In 1831, thousands were forced to march to present-day Oklahoma. Heavy rains, freezing weather, hunger, and disease killed many. A Choctaw chief described it as a trail of tears and death. Next came the Creek Nation. In 1836, U.S. soldiers rounded up over 15,000 Creek men, women, and children. Many were chained, driven west like prisoners. Hundreds died along the way. The Chickasaw tried to negotiate. They agreed to sell their land, hoping for better conditions. But the money promised by the government was delayed, and many Chickasaw also suffered and died during the move. The Cherokee resisted the longest. They fought in the courts and even won a Supreme Court case. But in the end, a small group signed the Treaty of New Echota without the people's consent. In 1838, U.S. soldiers forced 16,000 Cherokee on a brutal 1,200-mile journey. Nearly 4,000 died: children, elders, families torn apart. This became the most famous Trail of Tears. The Seminole in Florida refused to leave. They fought the U.S. Army in the long Seminole Wars. Some were killed, some captured, but many escaped deep into the swamps, where their descendants still live today. Each tribe's story was different, but the pain was the same. They lost their lands, their homes, and thousands of lives. Yet they carried their traditions, their language, and their spirit westward. The impact of removal was devastating, but the survival of these tribes shows their strength. Even after the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole still live on, a testament to resilience in the face of injustice. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave the U.S. government the legal power to remove native tribes from their lands. But how exactly did the government carry this out? And what was their justification? The government claimed removal was necessary for progress. President Andrew Jackson argued that Native Americans could not live side by side with white settlers. He said moving them west would protect their way of life. But in reality, it was about land, cotton, and gold. The government's role was active and forceful. They sent officials to pressure tribal leaders into signing treaties. Many of these treaties were unfair, signed under duress, or agreed to by just a few representatives, not the entire tribe. Still, the government treated them as legal contracts. Once treaties were signed, the U.S. Army stepped in. Soldiers went village to village, rounding up families. They gave little time to gather belongings. Homes were burned, crops destroyed, and people forced into camps before the long march west. The government called this process relocation. But for Native Americans, it was nothing less than exile. Thousands were forced to march hundreds of miles in harsh conditions. No proper food, no shelter, no medical help. When criticized, government officials said removal would bring peace and civilization. They insisted it was better than constant conflict with settlers. But the truth was clear: the government valued expansion and profit over justice and humanity. The U.S. government's involvement turned a law into a tragedy. By organizing, enforcing, and justifying the removals, they directly caused the suffering and deaths of thousands of Native men, women, and children. The role of the government in the Trail of Tears is a painful reminder: when laws are twisted for power, justice disappears. Among all the Native American tribes, the Cherokee Nation fought the hardest to keep their land. They believed in law, not war. Instead of fighting with weapons, they turned to the courts. In 1831, the Cherokee filed a case in the U.S. Supreme Court, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. They argued that Georgia had no right to interfere with their lands. But the court refused to hear the case, saying the Cherokee were not a foreign nation, but a dependent people. It was a crushing setback. Yet the Cherokee did not give up. The very next year, 1832, another case reached the Supreme Court, Worcester versus Georgia. This time, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee. Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community with rights to their land. Legally, it was a victory. But there was one problem: President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. He is often quoted as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." With that, the Cherokee's legal win was meaningless. Still, the Cherokee tried everything to resist removal. They adopted American-style farming, schools, and even created a written language. They published newspapers, wrote petitions, and appealed to Congress. They wanted to prove they could live peacefully as neighbors. But the U.S. government ignored their efforts. In 1835, a small group of Cherokee leaders, without the approval of most of their people, signed the Treaty of New Echota, giving up their homeland in exchange for land in the West. The majority of Cherokee rejected it, but the government used it as legal justification for removal. In 1838, U.S. soldiers arrived. Families were dragged from their homes, villages destroyed, and thousands forced onto the long march west, the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees' resistance showed courage, intelligence, and dignity. They fought with words, with law, with culture, but against political power and greed, their voices were silenced. Their street. In the year 1838, the nightmare began. U.S. soldiers arrived in Cherokee villages, dragging families out of their homes. People were given only minutes to gather belongings. Many left behind tools, clothes, even family heirlooms. Their houses and crops were destroyed. More than 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were forced into makeshift camps. From there, the soldiers ordered them westward, to what is now Oklahoma. This march became known as the Trail of Tears. The journey stretched over 1,200 miles. Families had to walk through forests, rivers, and mountains. There were no proper wagons for most, no horses, only bare feet on the frozen ground. Winter brought icy winds. Many had no shoes, only thin blankets to cover themselves. Food was scarce. The government promised supplies, but rations often arrived late or not at all. People survived on small pieces of bread, spoiled meat, or whatever they could find along the road. Hunger weakened them, making disease spread faster. Sickness became their constant companion. Dysentery, measles, and pneumonia killed hundreds. Children cried from fever, elders collapsed from exhaustion, and mothers held their babies close, hoping to keep them alive. Soldiers forced the march to continue, even when the weak fell behind. Graves lined the path, shallow mounds covered with stones, where loved ones had to bury family members before moving on. Imagine the pain, saying goodbye to a child or parent, and then being pushed forward the very next morning. By the end of the march, around 4,000 Cherokee had died, 1 out of every 4 who started the journey. Their tears, their suffering, gave the march its name, the Trail of Tears. Yet, even through tragedy, the Cherokee carried their songs, their prayers, and their traditions. They lost their land, but not their spirit. The Trail of Tears stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history, a story of unimaginable suffering, but also of survival. When the U.S. government wanted Native American land, they rarely asked politely. Instead, they turned to treaties, agreements that often looked legal on paper, but in reality were signed under pressure, trickery, or outright force. One of the most infamous was the Treaty of New Echota, signed in 1835. Only a small group of Cherokee leaders agreed to it. Most of the Cherokee Nation, nearly 16,000 people, opposed it. But the government treated it as official, claiming the Cherokee had, voluntarily, given up their homeland in Georgia in exchange for land in the West. This treaty sealed their fate. It gave the U.S. government legal cover to remove the Cherokee by force. In truth, it was not an act of choice, but of betrayal. The Cherokee were not the only ones. The Choctaw were pressured into the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830, giving up millions of acres. Many Choctaw leaders signed because they knew refusing meant war or starvation. The Creeks signed treaties after losing battles, forced to surrender their fertile lands in Alabama. The Chickasaw tried to negotiate better terms, but still lost their ancestral home. Even the Seminole, who resisted fiercely, were eventually cornered into signing treaties that pushed many of them out of Florida. The U.S. government called these treaties fair exchanges. Officials promised money, supplies, and new land in the West. But the promises were often broken. Payments were delayed, supplies were rotten or stolen, and the new lands were unfamiliar and harsh. For Native Americans, signing a treaty was like choosing between two evils: surrender your land, or face war and destruction. Either way, the result was the same: loss of home, culture, and countless lives. The story of these treaties shows how power can twist justice. On paper they were legal agreements. In reality they were weapons, tools used to take away the lifeblood of entire nations. The Treaty of New Echota and others like it remind us. The Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears were not just about losing land. They struck at the very heart of Native American life, their culture, their families, and their future. For centuries, Native tribes had lived on ancestral lands where every river, mountain, and tree carried stories of their past. When they were forced west, they lost more than homes. They lost sacred places, burial grounds, and the spiritual connection to their ancestors. Social structures also began to break apart. Villages were destroyed, families torn from one another. On the long marches, elders died in large numbers, taking with them wisdom, traditions, and oral histories. Children grew up without grandparents to teach them songs, stories, and language. Many tribes had built schools, written laws, and even newspapers in their own languages. But removal shattered these systems. New lands were unfamiliar, often less fertile, and survival became the only focus. Communities that once thrived on farming, trade, and self-government now struggled just to live. Population loss was devastating. Thousands died from hunger, disease, and exhaustion during the removals. The Cherokee alone lost nearly a quarter of their people. For smaller tribes, the numbers were even worse. Whole clans vanished, leaving deep scars that could never fully heal. Culturally, the government also tried to assimilate Native Americans. After removal, many were pushed into adopting white customs, abandoning traditional dress, language, and ceremonies. The goal was to erase Native identity. Yet, despite all this, Native Americans fought to keep their culture alive. They carried their songs on the marches, whispered their stories to children, and rebuilt communities in new lands. The social and cultural impact of removal was devastating, but survival itself became an act of resistance. The strength of these nations ensured that, even after the darkest times, their culture, traditions, and spirit would never be. When the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830, not everyone agreed with it. Across America, voices rose in anger, sadness, and protest. Missionaries who had worked among Native American tribes spoke out loudly. They had lived with the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek. They saw them build schools, churches, and farms. To the missionaries, removal was not protection, it was injustice. They wrote letters, gave speeches, and warned that America was betraying its own values. Abolitionists, who were already fighting against slavery, also criticized removal. They believed the government had no right to force entire nations off their land. For them, Indian removal was proof that America's leaders cared more about money and power than about justice and humanity. Even within the U.S. Congress, the debate was fierce. One famous senator, Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, gave a powerful speech against the Indian Removal Act. He argued that America was breaking promises made in treaties, and that morality demanded protecting native rights. Another congressman, Davy Crockett, also stood against Jackson, even though it cost him politically. But there were also many Americans who supported removal, especially settlers in the South. They wanted land for cotton and farming. To them, native tribes were simply in the way. Public opinion was divided, but greed often shouted louder than justice. Other Native American tribes reacted with sorrow and fear. They saw what was happening to the Cherokee and Choctaw, and many realized they might be next. Some tried to resist, others tried to cooperate, but the shadow of removal hung over them all. In the end, the critics, missionaries, abolitionists, and brave politicians, could not stop the government. Their words were drowned out by expansion and profit. Yet their voices remain important in history, because they remind us that not all Americans agreed with the cruelty of Indian removal. The story of public opinion shows us something. The Trail of Tears did not end when the marches were over. Its impact lived on for generations. For Native American communities, the loss of land was permanent. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole had once lived on millions of acres of fertile soil in the southeast. After removal, that land was taken over by white settlers and cotton plantations. The tribes were forced into smaller, unfamiliar areas in present-day Oklahoma. Much of that land, too, was later taken away. Sovereignty, the right to govern themselves, was also deeply damaged. Before removal, many tribes had their own governments, schools, and legal systems. But the U.S. government broke treaty after treaty, weakening native nations. Even in the new lands, tribes were often controlled by federal agents who told them how to live, farm, and govern. The population loss was devastating. Thousands died during the marches, and many more were lost to hunger and disease in the years after. Entire families were wiped out. Languages, songs, and traditions were silenced when elders and leaders died. The cultural wound ran deep. For generations, Native Americans lived with the trauma of removal. Children grew up hearing stories of the march, of hunger, cold, and graves left behind. The Trail of Tears became not just history, but memory carried in every family. Yet, there is also a story of survival. Despite everything, the tribes rebuilt. The Cherokee re-established their government in Oklahoma. The Choctaw and Chickasaw built schools. The Seminole in Florida never fully surrendered, and their descendants still live there today. The long-term effects of the Trail of Tears are a reminder of both loss and resilience. Native Americans lost land, sovereignty, and thousands of lives. But they did not lose their identity. Against all odds, their nations endured, living proof that culture and spirit can survive even the darkest chapters of history.